So the 2 p.m. Time slot, we've got a number of presenters that are joining us virtually. The first presenter is the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. JP Hornick is the president. JP, do you want to begin, or does one of your colleagues want to begin? As always, before you speak, introduce yourself for the purposes of Hansard. You've got 7 minutes, followed by each presenter has 7 minutes, followed by the rotations between the three individuals around the committee. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be taking the full 7 minutes. Good afternoon. My name is JP Hornick. I'm president of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, OPSEU SEFPO. My pronouns are they and them. I'm here with my colleagues from the colleges and university sectors, Christine Kelsey, Kella Scavio, and Jonathan Singer. And as a college professor, I've spent a great deal of my life on a campus, which are the spaces where we learn to think, grow, care for one another, which are all fundamental in how we move forward together as a province. But right now, we are facing the most devastating underfunding of post-secondary public education in decades. Bill 166, the Strengthening Accountability and Student Supports Act, has been presented by this government as student-centric and focused on transparency, mental health support, anti-racism, and anti-hate. I'm here because students in our post-secondary institutions do need support, but Bill 166 is not the support that they need. At the heart of Ontario's post-secondary crisis is a chronic multi-generational underfunding of post-secondary education and the refusal by government to focus on students by fixing the funding crisis. When we underfund these institutions, students suffer. Take counselors. Our public colleges have a well-documented counselor staffing crisis, and it's only worsened over the last 5 years. Without adequate funding for more counselors, it means long wait times for urgently needed mental health support. Our post-secondary institutions are supposed to equip students for a successful future, but a lack of support means that the students who need help most will struggle to complete their studies, meet academic expectations, and keep themselves afloat. Waiting weeks for a 20-minute appointment with a counselor when you are at rock bottom is egregious and worsens the risk of untreated mental health struggles. The wait to meet with an assistive technologist similarly can stretch as long as 6 weeks. There are roadblocks to recruiting student success specialists who play a pivotal role as proactive, vital supports for students who are struggling to overcome barriers. Insufficient funding means an insufficient number of interventions for students who need support the most. When it comes to student mental health, it's not a lack of policy that's the issue. It's a lack of staffing and resources because of chronic underfunding by the provincial government. When compared with the rest of Canada, Ontario is dead last among the provinces for per student funding of colleges and universities. Unfortunately, this government has not met its own panel's recommendations on providing financial support to these institutions. There is nearly $1 billion in funding shortfalls, despite what's being touted as a historic investment. Students and workers who are living through the funding crisis feel its consequences firsthand. So let me be clear. Our colleges and universities urgently need a sustainable increase to the annual base funding they receive from the ministry to ensure they are decent and, yes, supportive places to work and study. We need to do a better job supporting young people who are struggling. We see news stories of students living in deplorable conditions. Many of these students are international and racialized newcomers taken advantage of by predatory landlords. Students are juggling multiple jobs while struggling to afford food, rent, transportation, and tuition costs, often having to choose which one they're going to need to sacrifice that month. This government must focus on providing meaningful relief to students and their families in a cost of living crisis. But unfortunately, that's not what Bill 166 will do. Instead, Bill 166 undermines the fundamental principles of post-secondary education. Even though every college and university is already required to have policies in place to address racism and hate on campus, this bill pushes for even greater government intervention in such policies and is a significant overreach. We are deeply concerned that this bill signals the government's intent to intervene and impose itself in the internal affairs of colleges and universities, and in a really dangerous way. This isn't about putting the students first. There are already laws, regulations, and policies that concern speech in the public sphere. Government intervention will absolutely increase the threat of overreach by college and university administration or enforcement bodies, and it is no place for governments of the day. It's a real risk. These policies should not be used to censor dissenting viewpoints, and governments should not play a hand in surveilling freedom of expression and dissent on our campuses, full stop. We've seen how these policies have been used in the past. In 2018, when the provincial government required all colleges and universities to develop so-called free speech policies, it was political theater, pure and simple. University administrators were issued directives by the Minister of Colleges and Universities to silence dissent. This is not helpful. Our campuses are supposed to be places where ideas are freely exchanged and debated, allowing principled ideas about the world to flourish. Subjectively defining and codifying what constitutes racism or hate has a chilling effect on discourse, potentially leading to the censorship of speech that, while arguably controversial or offensive, is not necessarily hateful or racist. This move will create a growing environment of self-censorship where students, staff, and faculty may fear expressing opinions that challenge prevailing narratives or engage in debates that involve contentious issues. Our post-secondary institutions are in crisis, students are in crisis, and they do need support. But it's time to stop playing politics with our campuses and instead to focus seriously on what really matters, providing sustainable funding solutions.
You've got about 1 minute remaining.
And protecting educational excellence. Thank you. I will cede the rest of my time.
Thank you. Our second presenter, we've got a number of people online as well, one in person. I want to thank the CEO, Seth Gorin, for being here. Rabbi, you have your 7 minutes.
Thank you, sir. By way of introduction, I'm Rabbi Seth Gorin. I serve as the CEO of Hillel Ontario, which is an organization that amplifies Jewish student life at 9 universities across the province and serves 14,000 Jewish students. I appreciate you, Mr. Clark, and the members of the committee taking the time to convene this hearing and to respond to a variety of concerns, including the growing menace of anti-Semitism at Ontario's universities and colleges. While anti-Semitism may not be new, either in the world or on campus, it is growing, and the threat to Jewish students is rising. Anti-Semitism as a form of bigotry dates back thousands of years and has had grotesque, fatal consequences for millions of Jews over that time. Because I only have 7 minutes to speak, I won't be going to give you a complete multi-millennial history this afternoon. Instead, I want to focus on the campus situation prior to October 7th and how it's changed since then, so that you better appreciate the way in which anti-Semitism on campus is a systemic and persistent problem, not merely a recent or superficial development. As background, I've been engaged in Jewish campus and young adult work for nearly 2 decades, long enough to notice trends, see anti-Semitism's ebbs and flows, and cultivate an understanding of what works and what doesn't in prevention and reduction. I practiced human rights law prior to attending seminary, have taught university academic courses, and have led other more informal instruction on diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as interfaith dialogue. These experiences have provided me with a detailed array of specific, often painful incidents of campus anti-Semitism, a higher-level overview of general concepts, and everything in between. As I mentioned earlier, campus anti-Semitism is not new. Some pre-October 7th lowlights from the 9 campuses Hillel Ontario serves. As background from the 1960s and earlier, even before students could arrive on campus, quotas on the number of admitted Jewish students were historically pervasive for decades. Standards for Jews were higher than for other applicants as a whole, and many Jews never had the chance to earn university degrees because they were rejected and blocked from matriculating. More recently, in 2009, Jewish students at York were chased into the Hillel space in the student center by peers chanting, "Die, Jew, get the hell off campus," and similar phrases, and banging on the Hillel door and windows. Afraid for their safety and on the advice of university security, Jewish students remained at Hillel until a police escort arrived an hour later to evacuate them. A similar incident took place in the fall of 2019, instilling an ongoing sense of fear in many Jewish students, even if they were not enrolled at the time. In 2015, a TMU social work student was told she could not complete a placement at two major Jewish community organizations because, quote, some of their values seem to be in opposition to the values of the school. In her Watershed 2022 article, Dr. Ayelet Cooper detailed the legacy of anti-Semitism at the Temerity Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto and presented harrowing examples of how this bigotry continues to play out today. She chronicled everything from a colleague's position that, quote, those Jews who think their Holocaust means they know something about oppression, to testimonies about non-Jewish students who believed in the power of Jews to finagle or obstruct residency matches. These are some top-line examples, but they barely scratch the surface. Indeed, Jews on campus bear scars from regular and all too frequent abrasions associated not just with major run-ins, but also with casual microaggressions and lower-grade anti-Semitism, relatively speaking. The graffiti, the insinuations of hidden Jewish power, the implied connections between Jews and wealth, the dismissals of Jewish adversity or pain, delivered via peers' social media accounts, professional asides in class, offhand comments in interpersonal interactions, or printed media around campus, these barbs may seem minimal or superficial individually, but each subsequent one cuts deeper and deeper, aggregating into profound and upsetting emotional and psychological gouges that leave us on edge and uncertain, angry and fearful. There's no doubt this is getting worse. Hillel Ontario has received 9 times more incident reports this academic year than in 2022-2023. Others can share their direct experiences and provide concrete examples against this landscape of growing hate. But among the additional post-October 7th illustrations reported to us, mezuzot, Jewish ritual items attached to external doorposts, have been torn off Jewish students' rooms in residence halls and smashed, pieces strewn down the corridor. 2 Jewish students wearing kippot, traditional head coverings, in public were swarmed, accosted, and screamed at. Those confronting them threw objects at them before wishing them death. A student who hosted a Jewish event had rocks thrown through their windows in the middle of the night, shattering both the glass and their sense of security. We have observed an increase in both the intensity and the frequency of occurrences, an increase that shows little signs of abating. Consequently, Jewish families are discussing extraordinary measures, including taking on debt to send their children out of province or out of the country to places where they'll feel and be safer. As an immigrant to Canada and relatively newly minted citizen, it is painful to hear that the country that has, by and large, offered me a warm and enthusiastic welcome is becoming a place where fellow members of the Jewish community are isolated, anxious, or worse. I could continue with these comments and examples, but the bottom line is this. Anti-Semitism has been around for a long, long time. Anti-Semitism on campus has been around for a while, and they're both getting worse in both the frequency of their appearance and the intensity of their manifestations. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our final 2 presenters are online. They're from the Canadian Federation of Students, Ontario. Mitra and Adez, one of you can begin. Just make sure you introduce yourself for the purposes of Hansard. You can proceed. Can you hear me okay?
I was unable to unmute myself. Hi, folks. My name is Adeze, she, her pronouns, and I am the National Executive Representative at the Canadian Federation of Students, Ontario, representing over 300,000 students provincially, and I'm joined by Mitra Yakubi, the chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students, Ontario, and we're here today, as folks have already identified, to talk about the bill and to be able to provide consultation, and I think the first thing that I do want to speak to is the directive regarding costs. It is the position of the Canadian Federation of Students, Ontario, and the positions of students all across the province that education fundamentally is incredibly costly and one of the biggest barriers to access. Of course, there are many other barriers, as folks have identified, like the mental health issues on campus, like the ability to engage given identities and all of these other aspects. But the first and foremost, one of the main reasons students are unable to access education in its entirety and in a myriad of ways is due to the costs. And so when we look to the directive of costs, the directives as they are in this bill remain unclear. What parameters would cause an institution to be transparent? What does transparency look like in the current system of education that exists where funding has not been consistent? Is with the transparency for international students, what would that look like as well, given that there is no, as of now, regulation for international student tuition fees? Some of the most marginalized students on our campuses, financially and in other ways, are unable to engage due to the fact that financially there was no consistency or transparency for their tuition fees. So on a grand scale, via the minister and via the government, what would transparency look like for our institutions, and most importantly, for students, when we know that financial inaccessibility is one of the main reasons students are unable to access post-secondary education? And I'll pass it over to Mitra.
The next aspect of the bill that we'd like to speak to is the consultation process. We recognize that consultation plays a vital role in the development of a policy. It is through consultation that community members can express their concerns about the effects of a policy, offer ideas on how to make the policy better, share experiences that eliminate what a policy should do. Consultation can ensure that a policy works for a community and not the other way around. We are all here today because we believe to some extent in the importance of that consultation. That is why students today are dismayed and concerned that Bill 166 makes no reference to a consultation process regarding the mental health and anti-discrimination policies it requires and mandates post-secondary institutions to implement. The bill indicates that all institutions must have these policies, but fails to insist that students, faculty, and staff be consulted on their development. This means that institutions will create and implement these policies without input from student body as to their content or effects. It is our concern that this bill fails to adequately meet the needs of students they are meant to serve. Students, as well as faculty and staff, must be consulted on the development of all and every institutional policy, as they are the greatest stakeholders and most likely to be affected by them. The Federation insists that any directives regarding the content of these policies must be made in consultation with students. Without this, Bill 166 is inadequate and fails its supposed aim of improving student life. Lastly, we share and echo the concerns that have been expressed widely by faculty and staff across our post-secondary institutions. We reject government interference in our post-secondary institutions. Government interference in our post-secondary institution jeopardizes academic freedom, and that is essential for critical research in mental health and anti-racism. This bill overlooks decades of research and best practices that have been established by students, staff, faculty, and community members that are members of our campus communities who are the experts of their own lived experiences. We instead urge the government to increase funding for post-secondary education and who have been impacted by decades of chronic underfunding. This increase in funding can allow an investment in culturally responsive mental health support services and vital support centers such as sexual violence centers, equity support offices that are currently struggling due to understaffing and underfunding. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. We'll move to the question portion. We'll start with the independent member, MPP Clancy. You have 4.5 minutes.
Thank you so much. My first question is for OPSU, for JP. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about your worry in terms of overreach and lack of funding. I know I think it's important that we understand the impact. Maybe you could start with funding. I think the overreach I don't know if you've seen overreach and you could speak to the impact of that, but I think it's important for us to not just talk about numbers and not just talk about policy, but to understand the impact that that has for those working and living on campus.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that question. When we're actually looking at the notion of overreach, any government that then gets to issue directives about what counts as racism and what doesn't, what counts as support and what doesn't, is actually interfering with the basic fundamental responsibility of colleges and universities themselves, of the faculty, of the support staff, of the students. Without an adequate consultation process, which I would argue is already in place, and these policies are already in place, this looks like not even a solution looking for a problem, but actually an attempt to clamp down on free speech. And we have seen this again and again in history. One of the first things that governments do when they're challenged is start to clamp down on academic life as a space for debate and dissent. The issue here is truly, if you want to address mental health issues on campus, you do that by adequately funding the system and ceasing to allow funds to be diverted into private sector. So if you want to really support students, you do that through funding the system. You do that for making sure that all students have access and affordable access to post-secondary institution. You recognize post-secondary as an investment in the collective good of Ontarians rather than some sort of, privileged individual benefit. So that would be, where I would head with this. And, you have to remember, the government of the day might enjoy this directive, but the government of tomorrow might not issue the same ones that this government would enjoy.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the rabbi a question. I think the biggest concern I have around hate is that, there's so much division and tension on campuses. Maybe you've had experience of how I've appreciate locally the interfaith approach and how we can come together united. Can you speak about activities that you would encourage from campuses and how we can invest in an interfaith approach?
Yeah, so I would echo your take that interfaith and multi-faith approaches are incredibly effective in terms of diffusing tensions before they even arise. I would actually turn it over to my colleagues who are online, who have probably far more experience with this in a direct manner on campus. So Mr. Levy, Ms. Goldig, and Ms. Ressler probably could speak to this more precisely.
Sure, so I'll go first, no problem with that. I'm Dean Lavi, so I work as a director at Hillel York, which is one of the 9 universities that Hillel Ontario serves.
1 minute remaining.
And I'll just say very briefly so other people can speak. We found that interfaith work is very necessary, and at times part of the issue is getting people to come to the table. And a lot of the work needs to go in that direction, because especially since October 7th, we've seen a significant rise in people, frankly, at York, not wanting to work with anyone that is associated with any Jewish organization. And that's part of the problem. So I'll see the rest of my time.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? You've got about 20 seconds.
Okay, and maybe you could speak to the definition. I think folks feel it's important that we have that openness to be able to be critical of any government. And how does that impact your work?
So I think one of the challenges that we face is around kind of academic freedom, freedom of speech, and principles that
We're out of time for this round. We'll move to the 7.5 minutes for the government's first round. MPP Smith.
I want to thank all of the contributors today. And my questions, my first question is going to be to Seth. Thank you very much for being here. We've talked about free speech, and sometimes we know that it's a very positive thing on a university or campus environment, but sometimes it can step over the boundaries, and these students they feel, quite frankly, unsafe, and I've seen this firsthand. And safety on campus, as we all know, is an important factor to a student's success. And you reflected on some of those safety issues that students face. And these are our future leaders. If they don't feel safe, how can they thrive? How can they acquire those positions? How can they get to those jobs of the future? And they need to know that they will not be harassed on campus. So given we heard this, from others, and colleges and universities have sometimes been in a situation where they, 1, fail to report the incidences of hate, and 2, follow up. What is your opinion or your experience on that when you merge together the idea of Bill 166?
Appreciate the question. I think one of the challenges that we find on campus is that sometimes reporting processes are a little bit difficult and cumbersome for students. That some universities have, they have forms online where it's a little bit more clickable, it's a little bit more accessible, and that facilitates students actually sharing their experiences and allows the university to be more effective in responding to them. I would say that there are best practices that have been adopted by organizations like Jewish Federations of North America that have reporting processes that allow people to share what their experiences have been like and allow organizations to respond to them. So our experience on campus has been varied, I would say, that there are some institutions, some departments, some individuals who are very supportive and are very encouraging of people reporting because they want to do better. They know they can do better. And some have been less so. And it's difficult to paint with a broad brush. But the institutions that have, I would say, an openness to understanding and have cultural sensitivity to Jewish experiences are probably the institutions that are most effective at responding to student needs.
So standardizing this for colleges and universities across Ontario would be beneficial.
I think so, and I think that there are plenty of institutions that have best practices and would be able to share what a standardization could look like.
So in your experience, when it is adjudicated, how long can that process be?
Longer than often students would like and have the patience for.
And how would you say that has impeded that student's ability to go back go?
I think it's incredibly burdensome. I'm thinking of one particular case in particular where the student is continuing to get emails during exam period, even though they have specifically said, please do not reach out to me, I am in exams, please forward them instead to my mother. And she'll be able to filter, and she is authorized to respond in my stead. That when it takes this long and when it's being shared in these experiences, it has an incredibly adverse impact on student, not just experience, but also their academic performance. And it's the student who has to deal with the consequences of those things. It's the students who have to respond to what's going on. It's the students who have to pick up the pieces. And we as staff are the people who are there with them every day and have to support them in getting through this.
We have students that come into my office, and there was one situation where I heard a student did not, the adjudication actually was intended to happen. She'd graduated. It was 2 years later. She lived in Europe. I think this is a positive step, would you say, to make sure that things are timely. What would you say would be a fair period of time to, let's say, have something dealt with or reported?
I think it
and then followed up.
Yeah, so it probably depends on the incident. There are some incidents where it's kind of an open and shut case. We have very concrete evidence in terms of what's happened. It's difficult to understand why that would stretch out for, I would say, even a month. There are some things that are more complicated, where more testimony is needed. And there I would be understanding of a little bit more of a process. But the key thing, I think, is also about transparency. It's about understanding where students are in the process, what's being done, how long is this going to take, so that there's the aspect that you pointed to in terms of how long is this going to go. But there's also the idea of having university administrators who are responding to students and keeping them informed, and that strikes me as being equally critical.
Time?
35.
I will pass my time over to Natalie Pierre, please. MPP Pierre.
MPP Pierre, go ahead.
Thank you, MPP Smith, and good afternoon. Thank you to all of today's presenters. My questions will be for the Canadian Federation of Students. So I guess I just wanted to share with you that I was the former parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Colleges and Universities, and actually spent the better part of a year touring the province to colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes, speaking with faculty members, speaking with students, speaking with staff and other employees, specifically around mental health issues, concerns, accessibility, the full gamut. So I guess my question is around, my first question will be around mental health. So some of the things I heard from students specifically is not knowing where to go to find support. Sometimes that information wasn't easily accessible, and students found themselves in a moment of crisis, and that's just the wrong time for students to have to start navigating the system. You're already your thinking may be a little impaired at the time, and it's even more challenging to start sifting through information, going to websites, sorting through information, and trying to find how to reach out and get support. So that was one of the things that I heard from a lot of the students that I spoke with. So just wondering, what more, from a student perspective, do you think our colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes could be doing to support student mental health?
Absolutely. The first piece, which I believe you touched on, is accessibility. So many of these services on our campuses either are inaccessible to students, or students aren't even aware that they exist. And that is because we need our institutions, and more broadly everyone involved, to take a holistic approach, to take an approach in which we are outreaching to students, and we're not trying to deal with these issues in the aftermath, but we are approaching proactively to ensure that mental health is something that is discussed all of the time on our campuses. Further, you mentioned
I'm sorry, this round is finished for the government. We'll now move to a 7.5-minute round for the official opposition. MPP Sattler.
Yes, thank you very much to all three of the presenters this afternoon. I have a number of questions, but I did want to start with JP from OPSU. And I was really struck by your comment that it is the lack of staffing and resources that has caused issues on post-secondary campuses in terms of access to mental health supports, and not a lack of policy. And you talked about the chronic underfunding, the devastating underfunding of post-secondary in the college sector. You get 44% of what of the average of other Canadian provinces, and this has a real impact on the services that students receive. Your members are present in all 24 Ontario colleges in the province. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the work that they do to support students and how the lack of funding and resources affects their ability to provide the supports that students need.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm joined here by, support staff in universities, support staff in colleges, and faculty in colleges. And I'll echo what, my colleague from Desi from CFSO is talking about, which is that, the accessibility for students of mental health services is reliant on adequate staffing for those services. The proactive investment in mental health supports means that you see a decrease in, the struggles that students are facing, particularly in the midst of, cost of living crisis, housing affordability, climate change, global war. We're looking at folks who are facing what seem like insurmountable circumstances on top of trying to pursue post-secondary. So unless we're investing in the people that are able to provide those supports, and that includes our learning technologists, to our counselors, to, our frontline services, to our faculty, we're actually underserving our students. There is no lack of policy. This strikes me, Bill 166 strikes me as a very convenient piece of political theater that is, and of course, we should be fighting the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and racism on our campuses with everything that we have. We should be creating physically safe spaces for students. But the pursuit of post-secondary is supposed to make people slightly uncomfortable. It is to challenge our presumptions that we come into that environment with. But to do so well, we also need to provide the mental health supports and services, and that comes through adequate funding.
Thank you very much. I now want to go to CFS Ontario, and one of the concerns that was raised by OPSU about the government, the significant government intervention that is reflected in this bill, was also mentioned, Daisy, in your, or Mitra, I'm not sure who talked about it, but certainly it was mentioned in your presentation as well. I wondered, from the student perspective, if you could tell us how you think the objectives of this bill could have been better accomplished without this significant government overreach that is reflected in Bill 166.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think ultimately JP has talked about it as well. There is a lack of funding across our post-secondary institutions. There is a lack of support for students, period. What we're seeing, whether that's through the experiences of students that are talking about their mental health support, like mental health looks like a variety of different things when it comes to what that support looks like. Adese talked about that approach being holistic. What we really need is an investment in students, whether that's through the supports that we're able to provide and not necessarily, increasing the carceral approaches that our post-secondary institutions take through policing on our campuses, through securities that actually intimidate students on our campuses and ultimately impact both their mental health, but also their performances within their classrooms. I think there is a need for us to stress the fact that there is a lack of support across our post-secondary institutions in every avenue we can possibly think about, whether that's through their mental health resources, academic resources, any resources on campuses. We need to increase funding. We need to make sure we're providing support that is necessary for students. And one of the things that I want to talk about in interference is we know that this government has implemented policies that prevent student unions from doing the work that they do on our campuses that provide support for students on campuses, whether that's their food security, food centers, whether that's the sexual violence support centers. Student unions and campus groups provide a pivotal community space. It's important that they be invested in and supported to continue to do the work that they do instead of being attacked for their work.
Thank you, Mitra. And just going on from there, you mentioned in your presentation about the consultation process. There is no consultation process outlined in this bill whatsoever. And again, from the student perspective, can you talk about the importance of an extensive consultation process that involves students and faculty and staff and community and experts when you are developing policies like the ones that are required in this bill on student mental health and anti-hate and racism that would so directly affect the lives of students on our campuses?
Absolutely. Consultation is of the utmost importance. Our campuses, our communities, like JP said, we attend post-secondary education to be challenged, to be placed in community with one another. And consultation is of the utmost importance because ultimately we as students and as professionals on our campuses, whether that be the teaching assistants, the staff, the faculty, we know what we are experiencing. We know the landscape of our campuses. We know what students are going through. And consultation provides us an avenue to directly share.
There's 1 minute remaining.
On our campuses. Absolutely. Thank you. Directly share what's happening on our campuses and to be able to work together to identify what is needed. Like Mitra already said, anti-carceral approaches, holistic approaches, more funding, more availability, more accessibility. Those things can only be told through the experiences of students having to wait so long to get access to these things and often having access that isn't really helpful in them addressing their mental health.
Thank you. And finally, back to OPSEU. Was there any consultation with OPSEU, given that you represent members at all 24 colleges in the province on this bill?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, we'll move to the second round for the independent member. You've got 4.5 minutes. You may begin, MPP Clancy.
Thank you. I'll go back to the rabbi because we were kind of cut off. But I just wanted to say I'm so sorry for the harm that your community members and students have been experiencing, especially in the. But I wanted to ask you if you could speak to how, I think folks are worried that they can't be openly critical of Israel or other governments or Hamas, and so maybe you can speak to how do we juggle that, when people are, it's an emotional issue, and universities are places for debate, and how do we make sure we can do that in a healthy way without causing harm?
Sure, I think it's an understandable concern. I would start off by saying that the principles of academic freedom and freedom of speech are not absolute, and they never have been. That there are always constraints in terms of what people can say and what the consequences for what they say will be. So I don't know that we're talking about something that's kind of a difference of kind. I think it's more a difference of degree. In terms of how do we figure out what those boundaries are? I think, as with anything else, when we talk about hate speech, when we talk about the damage that is caused to people, the way it upends people's lives, is it can be severe. I can only offer kind of a Jewish perspective and kind of a more general one, which is that a student should have the right to be on campus free from being attacked verbally and physically and personally because of the identities that they carry. And I think that that is an understandable reason for people to be concerned. I would not argue that this is an easy road to hoe. I think it's difficult to try and figure out what the balance is. What I would say is that having witnessed the catastrophic impact of some of the language and some of the terms that are being used on campus nowadays, it really provides us with the energy to try and figure out how do we protect our students from words that are more than just opinions, more than just perspectives, more than just a take on world politics. And I think that there are things that have happened on campus that are not just about free speech. Free speech isn't about putting a brick through someone's window. It's not about accosting someone on the street and screaming at them. It's not about wishing death to them, to their families, and to their entire community.
No, I agree.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
No, I think the speaker before said she was worried that anti-Semitism was being defined as anything negative about Israel, like being critical of the state of Israel was being termed as anti-Semitism. I hear you on there's so much hate going around, and we need timely responses. I think otherwise people feel like they can't go back to school, they can't go back to class, or they can't trust the institution they're attending. I have a close friend who's Jewish and works in a school board and felt that her concerns weren't taken seriously. So, yeah, you're juggling many things, right? But I guess that definition of anti-Semitism was something that an earlier speaker brought up.
Yeah. So I to begin with, Hillel Ontario as an organization endorses the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's the definition that's been adopted, I believe, by the federal government and by the provincial government alike. The IRA definition specifically says that criticism of Israel in and of itself is not anti-Semitism, that there may be things that cross the line, but
there's 1 minute remaining.
But it's not inherently any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. I don't think anyone in the Jewish community would say that that's necessarily the case. I certainly wouldn't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just have one question for your CFSO. You talked about some shortages in the Sexual Assault Support Center. Can you elaborate on the impact of underfunding in those areas?
Absolutely. On our campuses, sexual violence is incredibly prevalent. We often see, for those of us who take on a leadership role as students on our campuses, an uptick during times like orientation, during times like spring break. We know consistently there are times our sexual violence centers are swamped. And it's not only in these busy times, but consistently throughout the year. As we see more and more money and funding getting shifted away from these centers and into other initiatives, we know that means one less person able to provide immediate support, one less person able to provide ongoing support, one less person who is now unable to be there in a moment of crisis, which means insecurity.
We'll now move from the independent members questioning 7.5 minutes to the government. MPP Pierre.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd just like to circle back to the Canadian Federation of Students. I know last time we were talking about mental health, and our conversation was cut short because we ran out of time. So I'm just wondering if you have anything you'd like to add. So just as a reminder, we were talking about students being knowing where to turn to, knowing what supports were available. And then I asked you what more you think institutions can do to support student mental health that's not already in place today.
Thank you. I think it was highlighted really well both by Mitra and my colleague JP. So ultimately, more funding, more availability, less carceral approaches, and culturally reflective and culturally competent care for students and for the entirety of the community as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So in the consultations that I did do with a number of students and stakeholders across the post-secondary sector, there are a variety of supports that are available in terms of service offerings, both on campus and referrals within the community, peer support, step level of care with the Student Health Services Department. So I'm going to switch now, and I'm going to ask, again, Canadian Federation of Students about the information in Bill 166. regarding transparency of costs. So we know, I think I heard mentioned earlier that education is costly and is in fact one of the barriers to access for a lot of students. So just wondering what your thoughts are around this legislation, asking or requiring clear and transparent picture of costs associated, including tuition costs, ancillary fees, additional costs for textbooks, lab equipment, any other kind of fees that are associated with attending post-secondary institutions, be that colleges, universities, or Indigenous institutes, what your feelings are about knowing that information up front.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think in terms of transparency about cost, as the Federation, we believe that post-secondary education should be free and accessible for everybody. If we had free education, we wouldn't have to worry about the transparency of the said cost and things like that, because unfortunately, as a student, me knowing the ancillary fees and things like that is great, but ultimately, where I'm paying a lot of money to is the tuition fees. The fact that tuition fees exist is a barrier in and of itself for me to access post-secondary education, and there are thousands of students across the province that are experiencing that. And when it comes to the ancillary fees, I think there is a need for us to start to recognize that those are fees that were voted on and decided by membership. Those are democratic decisions that have been made by members on our campuses. When we think about our food support centers, when we think about our sexual violence support centers, when we think about the peer support centers, those are mostly provided by our student unions and our campus groups and our campus groups that do that important work on our campuses. So I think there is a need for us to recognize that those services are provided because it was decided by members, and also continue to serve those holes that are left by institutions and the government themselves. So I think there is a need to kind of recognize the role that transparency cannot play, unfortunately, because they're paying so much money to be in post-secondary education. So if we are to truly support students, we need to have free and accessible education, because at the end of the day, international students are going to continue to be subjected to differential tuition fees to make up for that loss of revenue and the loss of public funding that they receive from the government.
So in terms of transparency of costs around additional fees and costs, is that a yes, that you would support the legislation that is asking for clear and transparent fees, including tuition, textbooks, the costs that are part and parcel of attending a post-secondary institution?
I think the transparency piece doesn't address the fact that students are still struggling with the high cost of tuition fees.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
My question is to Dan Levy and Katie Goldick from Hillel. I noticed the Hillel Ontario is the largest regional Hillel organization in Canada, providing leadership development opportunities. So thank you for doing it. In my riding of Mississauga Malton, we are very unique. 61% of residents are born outside Canada. 79% are visible community, and many of us come here for better life, and many of us have come for a safer life. Irrespective of anything and everything, we come here because we felt it's a safer, inclusive place. And as Canadians, no matter where you come from, but once you're here, thank you to Canada for giving us an opportunity. We're Canadians. Mm-hmm. But what's going on in last few months, we've seen something that I asked somebody to write a question for me, and the question came out was, as an organization that you work in the space of human rights, civil liberties, and supporting the youth, how do you strike the balance between supporting free speech and ensuring that a Canadian participating in debate with another Canadian feels safe and respected while these ideas are challenged? Dan or Katie? Yeah.
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Sure. I think the most important thing to say, sorry, there's a dog in the house. The most important thing to say is that I invite anyone who would like to come and join once the strike is over at York, to come into the Hillel Lounge and to hear the kind of dialogue that happens every single day among our students who are Jewish and non-Jewish alike. We feed them, and we take care that they have an environment. I'm so sorry. Katie, do you want to take over while I calm the dog down? Just take her piece.
We've got
Sure.
1 minute remaining.
Sure, I'll just build off of that to say that we, of course, encourage free speech and open dialogue in all spaces, and I hope in the entire university. I think the challenge is where we attempt to, or folks attempt to generalize about a specific individual or identity or community, and often, in the case since October 7th, from the Jewish community's perspective, is a lot of demonization of the country of Israel, as well as a generalization and demonization of the Jewish population. And that is where that sort of free speech becomes hurtful and harmful. And that is, again, open dialogue is encouraged, but when we start to generalize, or when we start to target, or when we start to speak ill of an entire community, it becomes really challenging for a Jewish student in particular.
Thank you for that. So that ends the government's 7.5 minutes. We'll now turn into the official opposition. MPP Sattler.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to go to Rabbi Goren. And thank you for coming today and sharing some of the experiences of the students you work with. I represent the riding of London West, and of course Western has a very strong and active Hillel chapter. And I just wanted to share, and I'm sure you're aware of this, at the end of October, there was an incident on Western's campus where postages of the hostages had been displayed, and another student removed them, tore them down, and there was a statement of condemnation that was issued about this incident from Hillel Western and Israel on Campus, the Muslim Students Association, the Palestinian Cultural Club, and the Western USC. And I was so proud of the community to come together to express this kind of unequivocal that this is wrong, this is hate, and this will not be tolerated on our campus. But I'm very concerned. I've heard feedback about Bill 166, about the fact that the contents of the anti-hate policy are to be developed through ministerial directives. So there's going to be, a top-down kind of directive as to what the policy shall include. And there are concerns about whether this will suppress free speech or what the implications would be. And I think that that Western incident, where we are continuing to experience both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campus, but I'm concerned that the coming together of student voices in a way that we saw at Western will be jeopardized by this top-down approach. And I wondered if you could just comment on that.
Sure. I understand and I appreciate your concern. I would say that that's probably less likely to be one of the outcomes. I would say that, and this I think gets to what Ms. Clancy was talking about earlier, the idea of multi-faith conversations, and how do we actually create the opportunity for learning that isn't hurtful and isn't hateful. My position would be that with additional support, and additional guidance, that universities and colleges will be in a better position to be able to foster that type of dialogue, and will be able to elevate it and put more of an emphasis on it in the role of student development, both identity, academic development, and the like. I would say that the Western example was wonderful, the one that you pointed out in terms of a consensus statement. I would also say that it's sad that was really one of the few that we saw. One of the things I would say is that prior to COVID, we had very strong interfaith, multi-faith groups on campus. We had Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian, Muslim dialogue groups that blossomed on our campuses. And I wouldn't underestimate the impact of COVID in terms of erasing so many of those relationships. And we were just starting to get those back. It was commented on earlier that often other groups do not want to engage with Hillel or with Jewish groups as a whole, that there often is this sense of painting all of us with a very, very broad brush. But I would say that anything that gets to encouraging dialogue, encouraging conversation, and the discussion of different opinions on these perspectives. One of I think it was Mr. Anand who earlier was talking about how do we cultivate an environment where people can share different perspectives. I do think that that's important. That's something we try and do. We try and make it so that we are one of the few spaces on campus, and I would say in students' lives, where they're going to hear different opinions, different perspectives. That's what university is supposed to be about. That's what college is supposed to be about, that type of personal, intellectual growth. So I understand the concern. My understanding of the bill is that it is less likely to inhibit that type of growth and far more likely to encourage and to foster it.
Yeah, I think that the concern that several presenters have pointed out who are in the sector is the chronic underfunding of the sector, and so the concern about the lack of support and resources that will be there to foster that kind of dialogue that we need to see. But I wanted to go to CFS Ontario again, and just kind of continue this discussion about the lack of resources because of the chronic underfunding of post-secondary education, and what you are seeing from a student's perspective in terms of the impact of that underfunding on the mental health services and supports that are available for students, on the ability of students or of institutions to provide the kind of support that students need.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think ultimately what we're seeing across our campuses is that mental health of students are impacted by a variety of things. And I think there is a lack of understanding of that. For example, students are renters, students take transit, students are impacted by the climate change, students are impacted by a variety of issues. So ultimately what we're seeing across our campuses is that there is a lack of funding, they have to pay their tuition fees. Oftentimes they're choosing between paying their tuition fees and, eating, taking the transit, paying for their healthcare if they're international students, because they're also not covered by OHIP. There are so many issues that students in general are impacted by that are not addressed. So what we're seeing more and more is that students are in distress and students do not have those supports that recognize those different experiences, right? It's not enough to say we have a mental health support center. Yay, that is good. There's 2 workers that are going to support, let's say, 15,000 students, because I know that's the experience that we had on my campus. There was 2 support workers that were there to provide support and care for 15,000 members. That is just not viable. That is just not enough. So what we're seeing time and time is that staff are also overworked. They are underpaid, and the systems that exist are underfunded. And that has direct impact on how students continue to go through.
There's 1 minute remaining in this round.
Experience and also their academic experience, because those go hand in hand.
Thank you very much. Just quickly back to OPSU and JP. Again, on the issue of the underfunding, the government has touted its investment, which was only half of what its own expert panel had recommended. Did you see that funding announcement that came along with this legislation? Was that sufficient to address the fiscal crisis that our colleges and universities are facing?
Absolutely not. And, I see this as a way to substitute policy to try and address a problem that funding would help with, because what we're hearing from all of us is that it's those one-on-one conversations, it's that attempt to create civil discourse by engaging one another as humans, which cannot be
I want to
substituted
thank everyone
policy.
for their presentation. I want to thank the members for their questions, and thanks again.